everyone, and thank you for coming to now our third roundtable of the Everything Conducting website. This month, we are featuring all things wind ensemble, wind band, and wind conducting. And I'm so happy to have such a wonderful group of people to talk about everything wind ensemble today. And Enrico will now take over and tell us who everyone is.
Absolutely. Starting with Jessica Swift, who is a conductor of the Concert Winds and Philharmonia Orange at the San Diego Youth Symphony, where she also teaches theory and composition. Thank you so much, Jessica, for joining us this evening. Then we have Dr. William Lake Jr., who is the Associate Director of Bands at the Crane School of Music and Assistant Professor of Music Education. William, it's great to see you. Then Travis Cross, who's Professor of Music, the Wind Ensemble Conductor and Music Department Chair at UCLA. Go Bruins. Good to see you, Travis. And finally, Scott Stewart, who is Music Director at the Atlanta Youth Wind Symphony. It's great to see you, Scott. Thank you all so much for joining us. We're going to kick things off with Ankush. Want to give us our first question for the evening?
I do. So a lot of us grow up in our career doing lots of different kinds of ensembles. I know I started my career conducting with a lot of youth orchestras, and I've had all kinds of different wonderful experiences, also challenges in terms of recruiting, in terms of getting players. And I imagine it's quite interesting to try to get a bassoon player to choose the wind ensemble versus the orchestra versus a chamber group. And so when you're at, and some of you are in college, some of you are working with high school students. So at your specific ensembles, what are the joys and challenges and difficulties and wonders of recruiting? And also, we didn't really talk about yet, but really building a program, like getting a group to kind of flush out and become more mature over a couple of years. Any tricks of the trade for that? Jessica, I'd like to start off with you.
Thank you, Ankush. That's a really great question. And certainly one I think that a lot of us continuously think about, because it doesn't have a stopping point. Your program isn't just someday built and then we let it be. What you can do, though, I think, is put in some pieces that can go on autopilot to help sustain and retain, in addition to the recruitment piece that you'd mentioned. Depending on which level you're teaching, you may or may not have students that are, as a majority, planning to go into music. I work at the San Diego Youth Symphony, but my kids tend to be middle school to high school, so some of them may be discerning, but the experience that I build there isn't prioritizing that. I think either way, though, what you do want to build is a positive experience that's going to be very engaging. You're creating a culture, a community for them that they want to come back to. And if they're an older group, there's going to hopefully be a built-in intrinsic motivation for them to continue in their development. And also some really intentional programming to meet those specific goals, depending on if you're working with future music majors or more recreational players, or maybe something in between. What I've learned is that if you can get student buy-in and potentially parent buy-in for younger groups, that can help just create that cycle of regeneration and take that a little bit off of your shoulders. The other thing I found that fellow colleagues are appreciative of is creating vertical relationships with feeder schools, feeder programs, or if it's a larger program like the Youth Symphony, we have some pathways in place so the kids really know where they're going, and the kids that are following them can see that as well to have those goals to reach.
That's really excellent. I always think about getting a particular student to buy into, if they only play trumpet and marching band, like, now how are you gonna get them to really think about Alfred Reed or different kind of music that they're, or Beethoven, or anything along the spectrum. William, do you have any thoughts on recruiting and building a program that you'd like to share with us? And what kind of experiences have you had? I know you've done both, the high school and college level.
Absolutely. I think the big secret that doesn't change no matter what the ensemble is building relationship. Relationship between you, the conductor, and you, the ensemble, and then the relationships that happen in the ensemble away from you are critically important, and the relationship that you have with various stakeholders. So that would be immediately the students' parents. If you're in a school system, it's the relationship that you have with your fellow colleagues, the administration, and then it keeps going, kind of blooming out from there outside of the four walls of the actual university or high school situation. I think that's the lifeline of the program, the relationship and engagement that happens with your program and the community itself. I teach future music educators, and I tell them to treat your individual program as if you are like a mini Kennedy Center or a mini, arts institution, because you've got to be thinking from the idea of the advocacy, the relationships. You've got to wine and dine, you've got to sell it, and you've got to make the music happen in the classroom. So I think the idea of relationships are built through engagement, not outreach. Outreach is absolutely horrible, like a one and done sort of, it just doesn't work. And I tell my students, you can't treat people like you might on Tinder, where it's like, nope, don't want it, swipe left. Like, no, 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 no. You've actually got to engage with people to form these lasting sort of connections. And then that's what makes the program sort of all get into the autonomy that Jessica was talking about. It's because then mentorship happens from within, and that you can sort of distance yourself from that process and then rely more on visionary tasks or larger musical leadership tasks, because the ball's already rolling with those things in mind.
So when you have a program like that, William, for you have a couple of years to build something, what if you only had like, a couple of years, like just 1 or 2 years, you just got in, you're new to a high school band program, you're just starting out, you're new to the room, you're new to the school district. Like, what kind of things did you do? Because I think you said you started at a high school level. What kind of things do you remember from your first years of that? Trial by fire, I imagine.
Absolutely. No, it was fun. So I set up a whole table, recruitment table in the cafeteria as students were coming in. I had just been hired. It was before people even really knew. They knew that the person was going out. Really weird, awkward situation. But anyway, and I set up, I grabbed the marching band banner. I grabbed some trophies that were like 30 years old. Like the students didn't realize they were that old. And then I found some marching band music from a local college, and it was just me and building relationships. And any sort of student that came in, I'm like, hey, do you play an instrument? Hey, do you play an instrument? And I actually remember going up to one student at the school, bigger guy. I thought he was probably a football player. I was like, hey, do you want to play tuba? And he said, yes, I do. And the crazy thing is, he was a senior, played in the ensemble, went to college on a marching band scholarship, played all 4 years, joined Kappa Kappa Psi. It's just like, that was it. And so that's one of the crazy things that I did in high school. And one thing that I've done at the Crane School of Music on Wednesday, especially because when you're 35 minutes from the Canadian border, it gets cold really early in the year. I started this sort of event called Wassail Wednesday. Now, this is definitely BC before COVID time, where I would actually bring in all the ingredients and make wassail in my office, open the door and let it percolate. And like the cinnamon, it would smell like Christmas. I mean, it would like stink up the whole place, and with wonderful aromas. And the students would come by and have like a hot apple cider beverage, and we would just sit around and talk. That's us getting the opportunity to build relationships away from me telling them, no, you're late, no, you're too loud, or whatever. It's, no, I'm a person and you are too, and I want to get to know who you are. So that's just an example of something I've done that's, I think, pretty unconventional, but the students love it. They hate that in COVID we haven't done it, and it's lasted.
Yeah. So you got to hustle. No matter
Yeah,
where you are, you
absolutely.
got to hustle and
The
think
grind
of
is
great
real.
new ideas. Yeah, absolutely. And Scott, I know your ensembles in Atlanta are not affiliated with a college or a high school. You have no warm bodies when you walk into a room in a situation. You have to get the warm bodies into your fold. How's that
Yeah,
going?
I've changed my syllabus, if you will, or my description of the mission of the group early on. I mean, the first mission, of course, is always to be the world's most famous band director. And when you're done with that mission, you move on to exactly what Jessica and William are talking about, which is these ensembles, whether it's in a school at the secondary or middle level or the college level, or in this case with a youth group, is about people and it's about art. And that's kind of it. Once you kind of get those priorities in place, then I think you have some traction. And so I used to think of the Atlanta Youth Wind Symphony as a pre-professional group. Like this is a pre-Juilliard, pre-Michigan something group that would train the world's up and coming great performers. And now the description reads something like, the goal of this ensemble is to provide a high quality artistic and social experience that is positive and non-competitive in a great environment, something like that. And that makes things much easier. It also takes the pressure off a kid who might say, well, gosh, I want to, go into pre-med or business or something that's not necessarily music, but I really love to play my clarinet. And I think I want to be a part of this awesome group. And I think with youth groups in particular, they're like phoenixes that explode in May and they have to kind of get reborn in the ashes the next year, right? We have about a 70% turnover rate. So the idea of having a tradition, the way that you can have a little bit more in a school situation is a little rough. So you do depend on exactly what Jessica and William are talking about, is creating relationships and the kind of environment where people say, I really want to be a part of that energy and be a part of that creative spark and be a part of art in my community. I also always kind of remind students occasionally that it's actually easier to get a position on the Supreme Court, where there was recently an opening, than to get a position as a tubist in an orchestra. It's probably easier to get struck by lightning. But you can be an excellent musician and still become a physician or an accountant or a computer programmer and keep doing that. And so I also like to promote the idea of make music before your life, during your life, and when you've retired from your life. And that's a good way to spend a whole life.
If I can just add to that real briefly, you'll also be a better physician and computer programmer, and you'll probably be a happier physician and computer programmer, and you'll probably be a better family member and a better community member. So, I mean, most of the students in my ensemble are majoring in music, they're majoring in music performance. They want to do this as a career, but even at Juilliard, most of them are not going ultimately to make their living solely from performing. So, all the things that music teaches us, which is not to say that we do music because it makes our SAT scores get better. It's not to say we do music because it helps us get into college, but all of those very intrinsic, very personal, very humane things that music does that allows us to appreciate beauty, to express our emotions, to be in a place where that is safe and encouraged and valued. I think there is no field in the world that is not enhanced by people who do that, and there's no life that's not made better by it.
Well, I have to admit that sounds like the end of a spectacular roundtable, but we've just gotten through the first question. So, one of the things that I noticed, like I, along with a couple of my other colleagues here, come from a wind background, but we moved to the orchestral side of things as conductors. And we have this intense fear of making a fool of ourselves in front of our future string sections. So for as soon as we become conductors, that's all we think about. And also, I find myself hesitant in a certain way to approach my winds because I know what I thought of the conductors when I played in an orchestra, and I don't want any part of that. So my question for you all now, maybe Travis, we start with you, is what is the primer for you for, let's say somebody is an orchestral conductor that finds himself in front of a wind band, or for heaven's sake, in front of their orchestral wind section. What are some of the things you've found that can be basic building blocks from the start for like the idea of a good sound, the idea of good ensemble, the balance, articulation, that you found work really well for you?
Well, thanks for the question. And I think the way I'll try to answer it is to say that what is it? What the species that we're closest to on the planet, like we share something like 97% of the DNA, yet we're very different animals. And I think you could compare a band and an orchestra, a wind ensemble, a wind orchestra, symphonic winds, whatever you want to call it, and a symphony orchestra in that way. We share a very large percentage of DNA. and a lot of things we have in common. And then there are just some very key things that make success a little different, that make how we get success a little different, and that are largely based on the culture of the people and the repertoire that are involved. So I think, you know, in all those settings, whether it's a band, choir, orchestra, jazz ensemble, rock band, musical theater, our goal is to make music, to realize an interpretation, to communicate that interpretation, to find cohesion, both artistically in terms of what we're trying to express, and then technically in terms of timing, precision, intonation, all those sorts of things. So those rely on fundamental musicianship. They rely on your listening skills. I've never met someone who can tell when something's in tune in an orchestra and can't tell when it's in tune in a wind ensemble, or can tell when something's together with a choir but can't tell when it's together in a band. I mean, these are the same skills. We just have to have slightly different strategies for getting them, perhaps. I think there are differences in culture. I think there are differences in how even wind players behave. The same clarinet player, the same trumpet player, when they're in a wind ensemble versus when they're in a symphony orchestra. And it depends on really the lift. It depends on the task that's in front of them. And what I compare this to is a sprinter versus a middle distance runner versus a marathon runner. And you might compare that to playing in a symphony orchestra, playing in a wind ensemble, playing in a brass quintet, or in a pit orchestra, where, you know, in a big Broadway musical, especially in a small reduced orchestration, when you take it on the road, that show might be 2.5 hours long, and you might have the horn in your face for, you know, 100 minutes or more of that show. When you're playing in the Los Angeles Philharmonic or New York Philharmonic, you might have a really, really important lick, a really important excerpt, something that is just so pressure filled that it could make you just melt on the spot. But in a 80-minute Mahler symphony, you might actually have the horn in your face for less than 15 minutes. Whereas in a wind ensemble, it's kind of somewhere in the middle there. You know, brass players especially, but also woodwind players are doing a little bit more of the pardon the phrase, the string player, you know, basic coverage at the same time as they're playing like a soloist. So you build different skills, you build different muscles. Whether you're a sprinter, a marathon runner, or a middle distance runner, you have to be in good shape. You have to eat well. You have to take care of your body. You have to, you know, take care of your mental state. But the way in which you train will be slightly different. And I think ideally, all of us, if we were physical education teachers, we want people to be able to do all of them. They may specialize in one, but we don't really want to turn out all sprinters. We want to have sprinters who also can go for a nice run by the beach if they need to. And so when we train students who come in and say, I want to play the Mahler 5 trumpet solo, and that's all I really want to do, well, you know, maybe there's something you can learn by playing the National Emblem March, or maybe there's something you can learn by playing the Maslanka 4th Symphony, or maybe there's something you can learn by playing Wine Dark Sea by John Mackey that will build your muscles in a different way. You know, a little tangent there is simply that I ask my students to always play with their best possible sound. I don't ask them to change their color or change their tone in order to blend in, but that's because I have a relatively small wind ensemble. We're talking, you know, sometimes we'll do octets, dectets, other times we'll do works for 35, 40 winds. My group is almost never larger than 50 or 55 wind players. Whereas if I were in a large symphonic band of 90 or 100 players, you know, we might approach the instrument a little differently. So my big task is play like a soloist all the time, and then get your ears open, and we will find a way to create not a blend, but to create a harmony or a consonance or a resonance from those sounds. Final thing I'll just say in answer to that question is, one specific difference I think between wind players and string players is I think string players like to play horizontally. Just the physical act of drawing the bow across the string is a horizontal motion. They love to live in their tone, and so sometimes as a conductor you need to push them along. You need to move more vertically to counteract their inherent horizontality to the sound. Whereas wind players are inherently more vertical. It's much more about the air starting and stopping, and it's much more about the tongue. And if you conduct a wind ensemble more vertically, they're going to play more choppy. So one of the challenges we have is to try to understand the inherent differences in how the instrumentalists approach their instruments, and then figure out how we as conductors and as teachers have to compensate to bring them, to help them overcome their inherent weaknesses and maximize their inherent strengths.
So Travis, one of the things that you said was about the way you encourage your instrumentalists to play as soloists, then you try to harness that creativity, and especially aided by the fact that your ensembles may be smaller. And, you know, if we could turn to Scott, I remember when I played clarinet in your wind ensembles for 4 years at Emory, we would do octets and we would do eightiets, and you would encourage different types of playing in those environments. Could you talk about your philosophies in that regard?
Yeah, I absolutely couldn't agree more with Travis's comment to always play with your best sound. I think that's something we should remind everybody at every rehearsal. I do find it sometimes ironic that a lot of us that sit in audition panels for our groups have them audition almost exclusively on solo repertoire, very flashy, virtuosic, high-level etudes and standard rep. And when they make our groups, we tell them never, ever to play like that ever again, because you're going to stick out. And I think when you do have a 1-2 part wind ensemble, that is certainly an imperative to always kind of be your own section. When the wind ensemble was formed at Eastman in 1952, Frederick Fennell was kind of at the point where he had seen and heard so many gigantic college bands, like well over 100 people playing in like the University of Illinois concert band, and there were just too many overtones in the room pretty much, and there wasn't an opportunity for virtuosic playing really to be heard with that kind of mass. And so his principles in forming the wind ensemble were basically to put about one person to a part with a few doublings in there to allow for flexible instrumentation like the orchestra, so that if you wanted to have a bass clarinet, you could, but if you didn't want it, you didn't have to. If you wanted some saxophones, euphoniums, you could invite them in, but not necessarily. And that you also could exhibit the full expressive capabilities, virtuosically and expressively, of every single instrument in the wind family and percussion family. And so I think some people have in their memory those either large outdoor ambulatory ensembles blasting away, or some of those gigantic gazebo concerts in the park of the 1900s. And that's their concept of band, which is what I often call the B word. So I try to use the word symphonic winds as much as possible. But I do sometimes try to call attention to the flexibility that you have to have with your instrument as a soloist, because you will be called upon at times to be a solo voice in a wind group. You also might be a part of a homogeneous group like your section, the saxophone quartet or the clarinet family, or the brass section may be playing something, and you kind of have to have a slightly different way of producing sound that fits into that grouping. And then there are times when we have tutti textures, when we have kind of all the way down the score, we've got sound generating from all sections, and that requires also some prioritization and knowing what your role is in terms of the timbre, the texture, the position in the chord, the position in the tune. And so I usually refer to those as solo, ensemble, and tutti tones. But certainly I would default to Travis's description that no matter what you do, you should always sound your best and play like it's your last gig.
So we've spoken a bit now about some of the roles of the conductor on the podium and the ways that we work with our ensemble and goals. But as conductors, you also know that you have a big influence in shaping the musical experience and essentially future life in music of musicians. One thing that I think is important now more than ever is realizing that that shaping can be in response to social and political events that are happening both domestically, abroad, that may be affecting the individual members of our ensemble, communities in which we perform, things like that. I'd love to hear from you all about in what ways are you planning to respond to some of the recent social political movements in the country, or what role do you think you have as the leader of these ensembles to do so? William, I know that you have posted about it on social media, and I've seen you on several panels and have enjoyed some of your conversations. Maybe you would kick us off with some of your thoughts.
Yeah, this is, I think this has always been our responsibility, but I think uniquely events around us have reminded us of our responsibility as far as our connection to culture and humanity, and that we are not self-serving institutions, that we have a responsibility to the cultures that we sort of gather our material from. And one thing that I'm just being reminded that it's not just what happens to the stage, to the audience, but that audience returns to the world. And there's something about what we do on the stage that should continue to reverberate in the people who have assembled to enjoy this art that we've curated from some sort of means of culture. And so I think one of the things is, of course, that we realize that, you know, we live in a diverse and a very dynamic cultural space. Thus, our music should also be that our students should come into contact with all of those diverse and very fluid spaces as well, that our students should see themselves reflected in, and I'm saying students, but I believe that this is true for even professionals. Like, these people should see themselves reflected in their unique intersections at many times, and see the reflections of other people in the ensemble at many times. I believe that we have to give the ensemble, and I don't want to say give, facilitate for the ensemble to see themselves in a mirror and then turn the mirror into a window. I think that's extremely, extremely important right now. So some of the things that I plan to do is student composition must be a bigger aspect of what we do. That to me is the greatest emancipatory voice that you can give, is a student writes something and it's from this peer set that we give it life. Even if it never hits the concert stage, we have to do that much more, way much more. The other thing that concerns me because of COVID is that it seems that we don't have a sense of creativity, and solo voice is lost. That, like, I can only make music if there's 60 other people in the room. I don't know if it's because I'm a pianist. I'm okay going into the room by myself and having a good old time. But I really sense in my students losing so much of their identity because they don't have others to share that with. And I do think that that's something that's still important, but I think we also have to really allow our students to have the space and to affirm, no, you are a musician, like, alone, like, you have a voice in this whole space. And so while this doesn't necessarily talk necessarily about diversity or equity or inclusion, I think it does, though, because once we begin to champion these unique voices in our ensemble, we're doing the work. We're listening to how we, you know, all uniquely interpret these 12 tones that, you know, are consistent, but they sound so different through a different lens and a different cultured experience. And so I think that's critically important. I'm going to give this space for improvisation. Even in the large ensemble setting, it's no problem for me because I happen to be probably one of the few wind ensemble conductors in the whole country that has a jazz degree in piano and still does that quite often. I don't, you know, like, improvisation is not a big thing. And to do it in styles outside of the classical idiom. Like, it's cool to add, your embellishment for the second time through and a Mozart serenade. Yep, that's absolutely awesome. But our students don't get to use those skills outside of that and to play around in a different sandbox. I just think that's critically important. And so those are two specific things. Maybe I've listed three. I can't remember my count now, but that I'm going to change. It's about giving agency and voice, and for us to listen more and be part of those unique sounds that are around us. Because I believe that a biased ear is only inches from a is from a biased heart. That is, a biased ear is only inches from a biased heart. So I'm trying to curate these experiences where my students are okay, engaging in multiple cultures, even if it's different than your own, but at least giving it a try and finding the value in those sounds as they happen. Because if you can't do it with the music, I just don't think you can do it with the people and engage with them outside of that space. So I think we have a really strong responsibility, and we always have. I think we're just now seeing our failed work as purveyors of culture and as music leaders, that we've got to shift things immediately.
I love that. And what a great idea, starting from within your very own ensemble and empowering your own members to take part in that. Scott, I mean, you work in one of the most diverse cities in the country, that is such a melting pot of cultures. How do you approach an issue like this?
Yeah, I really like the idea that William expressed about giving voice to voices that have not been heard. And I think the wind ensemble world has actually been great in many ways, in that when it was founded, the idea was we've got nothing, and so we better go find people to write music for us. And Frederick Fennell wrote like 400 letters and called his friends Vincent Persichetti and Howard Hanson, said, please write for us. And that kind of started the ball rolling of what most of us do, which is we're always trying to engage composers, whether they're just kind of up and coming or they're well established, to write repertoire for winds and percussion. It did, I think, this summer hit hard with Black Lives Matter that all of us that are in the classical music world stepped back and said, even though, I'm a good person, I'm a nice person, I'm not a racist person, we basically examined everything and were able to say, well, we are participants in a racist society because we live in the United States, and we're participants in an artistic culture that basically teaches and reteaches and celebrates a very narrow time period from about 1600 to about 1913, and anything before that is early music or ancient music. Anything after that is 20th century music, and it's largely music written by and performed for wealthy white European males. Now, not exclusively, but largely the composers that we celebrate, the music that we perform, the compositions that we celebrate as the highest achievements of human creativity are by dead white German men. And so that begs the question, well, where are the other people and their experiences and their voices, and why haven't they been invited at the table? And I think some of those questions were answered this summer. So I think one of my initiatives, which is even more urgent now, is to seek those unrepresented or underrepresented experiences and sounds that maybe take me out of my educational comfort zone, out of that Austro-Germanic canon, and force me to kind of look around and say, who could be a conductor, who could be a composer, who could be a performer, who could be a manager, and be a part of this classical music world, which has been very, very male-oriented and very, very white-oriented for a long time. So I appreciate the fact that I do live in a city where I have some good opportunities to seek those out, but I also know that it's gonna take a lot of investment on the part of like the whole classical music community to move in that direction.
And Travis, you're working with students who theoretically all want to be professional musicians and be promoting the next round of programming and the next repertoire programming wherever they may go. How are you thinking about these kinds of issues at UCLA?
No, I mean it's a huge responsibility. It's one of the most important things we teach, but that's true at every level. If one analogy I've used is that we're sort of feeding the members of our ensemble, and then they leave thinking whatever they've eaten that we've fed them is what is good food. So you know, at whatever level we are, we have a really powerful and sobering privilege, responsibility to be arbiters of taste for those students, and not just aesthetic taste, but values and priorities and all those other things. So I think the question about participation, about diversity, about you know, social justice really comes down to who plays, who listens, and what we play. And those are three opportunities we have to expand, to be more inclusive, to be more diverse, and to look in more directions. You know, the socioeconomic reality of getting good at an instrument, and not just talking about buying an R13 or you know, taking private lessons or going to summer camp at Aspen or something, but we're talking about, do you have a quiet place at home to practice? Do you live in a house where you can make noise at all hours of the night? Is there a parent or a family member who has to work and has to, I mean, there are myriad ways in which someone with just slight socioeconomic advantages is going to have an easier go of this than someone who doesn't. And that's hard for us to overcome in the classroom. It's hard for us to overcome when they walk into the high school. It's almost impossible for us to overcome when they walk into the university. So we have to continue to find ways to partner, like William said, to engage, not to outreach, to engage and to lift up other organizations and other experiences that give young people the chance to get the skills they need so they can come and compete for those positions and for those jobs and for those roles, and be just as good at pressing the buttons, because we've created ways for them to overcome the structural advantages. So that's a thing. I think you know, in terms of diversity of repertoire, especially, this has not been a huge area of strength for me, because, you know, I grew up in sort of a place where, you know, the wind ensemble is here, the orchestra's here, they're playing Mahler 1 in there. So we got to be playing something in here that really is comparable to that in terms of technical demand, in terms of artistic value. So a lot of us, and partially because the band is a young medium, because we don't have Beethoven and Brahms, we have a little bit of an inferiority complex where we try to prove that our repertoire is just as good. And I think a lot of it is. I think a piece written for band today and a piece written for orchestra today, our piece is just as good 9 times out of 10 or 7 times out of 10. But because of this kind of little brother syndrome, I'm going to do more Stravinsky. I'm going to do more Mozart. I'm going to do more Hammersmith, Holst, or Hindemith Symphony to try to, you know, establish my bona fides with what they're doing next door. But that pushes me further back into the dead white European men. So I think one thing that's helpful for us to remember is that we are not carving Mount Rushmore, which on its own is problematic in so many ways. But what we are doing when we give concerts is not permanent. So if we give a concert that has a piece that might not be quite as good, but it opens another door, it creates another opportunity, it pushes us in a different direction, you know what? No one's going to die. No one's even going to bleed. And I'm not saying we should perform just music that's purely representative and not consider the compositional content of that music. But I think we are just, I think we're kidding ourselves sometimes by saying that, you know, only the Schoenberg theme and variations and the Hindemith Symphony are quality music, and the Dahl Sinfonietta, and we can't do this other thing. The other thing related to that is that composers have to practice. Trumpet players have to practice, conductors have to practice, but composers have to practice. And if composers do not get performed when they're not that good, they don't learn the things they learn to become better. So that's another way in which we cut off at the knees people who don't immediately get into the summer festival, or who don't immediately get into the young composers program or something. So the more opportunities we can give people, the more we can invest. I'm going to spend 15 minutes out of a concert to give a young composer a chance to get better. A young composer who doesn't look like all the composers that we're already performing, that gives them a chance to get better and learn. Maybe the piece might be as good as anything else we played. It might not, but if it isn't, I've helped make that composer's next piece better and next piece better. And if no one is doing that, if we're not all doing that, then we're never going to get the number of composers writing at that level. Final thing I'll throw in here is that I do think representation matters in terms of who is in the group and who is on the podium. And this is an area where I have taken a little bit more leadership in my own personal demographic community. And it's been incredibly fulfilling, incredibly meaningful to try to help uplift and create community opportunities for, in my case, particularly Asian American, Asian Canadian conductors, band directors, to have a chance to see each other, to be seen by others, to have role models, to have friends, to have connections and networks. We had our first ever Asian band directors dinner at the Midwest Clinic 2 years ago. And what made me so happy even afterwards, we posted our picture, and Alfred Watkins posted a picture of the Black band directors gathering, which was the same night. And I'm now like picturing, there's this great picture of the SAG Awards or something where it was the cast of Black Panther and Crazy Rich Asians together. So I'm picturing a time when that dinner like kind of happens in adjoining rooms, and then we come together. But it was Alfred who actually wrote on my picture. He said, "Building a community is fun." And I think that's really important work for those of us who are fortunate enough to have jobs with enough comfort and security that we can put ourselves out there. And I think it's going to make a difference in the long term. Maybe Asian Americans are not the most underrepresented demographic in classical music, but we are still a minority. We are still victims of oppression. We are still victims of marginalization, and there's still a need for that community to be uplifted and valued. And in the band field, we are actually quite a small minority compared to our friends in the orchestra. So I hope that that's work that will pay dividends years later, when one of these young band directors takes their group to the state conference, and one of these young band directors becomes a college band director, one of these young band directors has a student teacher, and just the ripples in the pond of all those representation experiences will enrich our entire field.
And Jessica, you're, as Travis said, having an opportunity to feed the youngest of this chain of future musicians. What are some of your approaches and thoughts as you're going into doing this work?
So many great things have been said. I'm sure I'm going to reiterate them, but they're probably worth reiterating. Travis, as you speak about ripples in the pond, I'm imagining our work with ensembles, and we know that when there's an issue in the ensemble, it's happening at a micro level somewhere. And a principal once said, if something's happening in society, it's happening at our school. And so when we're thinking about the events of the summer, we have to recognize that that's happening within the institutions that we work with, that we work for, and within the lives of our students or our musicians in our group. And so I think, tying even back to that first question, when William so eloquently talked about building relationships, I think we have to start by just talking about it. And one of my favorite things I do to just get to know the young musicians is to ask them what they like to listen to, not just classical music or instrumental music, but really what do they have going on in their AirPods when they're walking around, and we talk about it. Something that was beautiful about the pandemic, it was obviously challenging to be a conductor on Zoom, but it forced us to have more conversations about music. And so I took my students through Western classical music history, very much snorkeling on the surface, and also through the history of jazz, and had them take some ownership of doing presentations on various musicians. And it becomes so obvious to them then when they have to present the information of the disparities that are still in current day. And so that generates a bit of momentum and a bit of ownership from them to talk about what we can do. The tangent to that, as William had suggested, is having them step into the shoes of a composer and giving them that experience, whether it's something they're interested in at first or develop an interest in later. At the Youth Symphony, I've seen that be very empowering, especially with young women who I don't think realized that was an opportunity for them before. And so I know I've touched on a few things that were already so eloquently said, but I think it really comes back to just having those open conversations with our students, something that we don't always train young teachers to do, the tough conversations, or young conductors, but one of the most important things that we certainly do.
Jessica, you just touched on a couple of things that I want to go into a little bit. The first thing is that, you want to represent what is around you, right? And, for example, when I went into conducting, there were very few women that I knew that were conductors, which made me go down all sorts of rabbit holes in figuring out leadership. And one of the things that I'm super excited about is finding music by underrepresented composers in the symphonic universe. And this last month has been very exciting for me to go down composers for the Wind Ensemble, for your field. And, one of the things I'm curious about in talking about the education are, what are some pieces that you use that you can encourage those students to, become someday? Who are some composers that you might direct these students to listen to that they can also perform?
Well, Anna, I really admire the work you're doing and look forward to hopefully picking your brain at a future time on what you've cataloged. Two composers that I found to be really impactful for students in Wind Ensemble in particular are Frank Kelly and Julie Giroux. Frank Kelly is a professor at USC, local guy, and he's somebody that's always had a great talent with two things. I think, first of all, palate and really understanding how wind instruments function. He's one of those guys that when you read a piece of his, I'm a French horn player myself, I find everybody's part is always really interesting to them, and the work is incredible. He also, that was the first thing, is able to write for any level. And so there's some great pieces for a young band, and then there's some great, amazing grade 5 pieces. One of the works that was impressionable for me as a young person and that I've carried into my teaching is an American Elegy. And so this work was commissioned for Frank Kelly to write following the Columbine High School shooting in Littleton, where I actually grew up. And so I got to experience this piece when I was an undergrad at the University of Colorado Boulder, and got to actually work with the composer, a bit, and have found that piece to just be really empowering and also probably current with what's been going on. So that's Frank Kelly. Julie Giroux is somebody that I think has been kind of an unsung trailblazer. She's even been a film composer since around the 80s. I believe she studied with John Williams as one of her teachers. And her work is just so vibrant and so effective at telling a story. Her works are very challenging. She's got some awesome grade 5 works, and they're just fun. And very technical. So for more advanced wind groups, I think she's a great heroine in the mix.
That's so great. I mean, it's so wonderful to hear about, first of all, that especially at a young age where people are playing music that is really encouraging young people to broaden their horizons. Again, I'm going to look back. William, you said something earlier on. We have a responsibility to our culture that surrounds us. And I love what that says because, our culture is lots of things. Earlier on in our pre-conversation, we talked about, not only is it gender, it's race, it's age, it's ability, it's all sorts of things. It's playing a specific instrument even possibly. William, I would love to have you talk with us about what you do with your students as far as, first of all, what are important pieces that you love to perform, but also how do you engage your students in order to be curious about finding more repertoire?
That's a great question. I'll give some composers that I truly value and I think are definitely worth checking out. One is Carlos Simon, who is an Atlanta native, Scott, and he's written music for all sorts of ensembles, including the Wind Ensemble, but also now forging a very fruitful career in the orchestral world. He's currently an assistant professor at Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C., and just recently landed an artist in residence position with the Kennedy Center. So he's definitely someone for us to be connected with. He does identify as a Black male, and he's absolutely wonderful inside and out. He has several pieces at different levels. His Amen is a difficult piece. It's challenging, but it puts you right in the middle of the Black liturgical experience. I enjoyed being kind of in the draft phases of that piece with Carlos, sharing my experiences as a church musician, and he was working on something, and I said, there's already a piece that does this whole ritualistic thing with different scenes. It was Symphonies of Winds, thinking Stravinsky, and I go, but instead of it being stratified as like these different doors and ideas, the cool thing about the Black church experience is like the experience from the beginning to the end. Like, can you walk us through what it feels like to go to church in the Black community in that tradition? And he was like, yeah, that's it. And so that's what he wrote. You really get the sense of everything from like opening devotion to testimonial to the preaching moment to the sharing of singing and shouting and dancing, etc. And so it's very authentic. You hear it, and for students who've or audience members who've been raised in those traditions, within 3 chords, you know exactly where this is, and that's what's awesome about his writing. I'll throw out another. Kevin Day is another great young composer who is writing right now. He's getting his master's degree at University of Georgia. But his music also brings in the harmonies and the language of Black America, which has been so distant from even the wind band setting. And so I think those are both composers to definitely check out. Your second question, as far as how to encourage students to dig deeper, I just require them to do it. And I ask questions about the pieces that they bring forward. I ask questions about, misappropriation that exists in our field, and what does that mean? Like, just because this piece has the word African in its title, what makes it African? And just because you pulled the djembe out and turned the snares off on the snare drum doesn't make this African. As a matter of fact, this piece is actually something else. It's not even part of this culture. And I throw it at them, or just being honest. Suite of All American Dances. Do you know about this cakewalk? And what does it represent? And do you really want to go there? And yet you can go there, but do you realize how much you have to explain and, cover your choice artistically? And you're choosing this over all of this other music that you could get, so just making them much more aware of their responsibility as a artistic leader and thinking like an artist, because I tell them what you include is just as important as what you exclude. Connecting with Travis, talking about like what you are, what you eat, basically, like that's it. And if you're not careful, you can end up digesting, sort of faux versions of cultural things. Like, just because, and I don't mean any offense by this, just because I call up, the local Chinese carryout does not mean I'm having authentic Chinese food at all. Like that's not it. And so we do the same thing with music sometimes because we're too surface level. And I tell them, you must do your homework. You must do the work, because really you can commit cultural violence when you don't. So I just think that's critically important.
Thank you so much. everything that you say just resonates so strongly with me. And, living in the Pacific Northwest, we don't have the cultural diversity that, places like Atlanta has. And, Scott, I would love to hear about what you're doing within your groups that are addressing this diversity in not only the musicians that we're trying to bring up, but also the music that we are playing.
I usually attack commissions from a couple of directions. One is supporting young people that are getting their start, as Travis said, giving them some spotlight and a chance to actually go through the entire process from the first note through the concert of a commissioning experience and writing music of the here and now. I also, when I'm able to cobble together the resources, love to find well-established composers like Frank DeKelly who are masters of their craft and are going to produce high-quality stuff right off the bat. One of my side projects, which I've found to be very interesting and challenging at the same time, is that I generally find that the average 16-year-old, and you probably don't want to think about going back to that space, but most of them don't consume symphonic music. That's not a part of their wheelhouse. A few of them do, but most of them are listening to either top 40 stuff or creating their own, but they're generally consuming it on their earbuds or AirPods and aren't really into that classical world that we are, unless they're watching a movie or watching a TV show or playing a video game. That's where they're probably getting the most consumption of symphonic-based music. So I made contact with Bruce Broughton a few years ago, and actually Travis hosted Bruce and my film music class at UCLA, and I have found Bruce to be super open to writing concert music in a cinematic style, but with the kind of craft and artistry of a top-level composer. And so Bruce, who's in his 70s now, we've commissioned a couple times and is really at the top of his game, writing amazing concert music for chamber and for orchestra and for winds, having had a 50-year career writing for Disney animation and the theme from Silverado and Tiny Toons and a really kind of amazing whole life of music for media, music for screen, that even my students have, I've seen Silverado, I've seen Tombstone, I know that guy. And connecting that world of music for screen to music for the concert hall. I've also been intrigued with the recent trend in composing something that has a visual element to it, some kind of art installation or film or short documentary or something behind the ensemble that is very normal for these kids, because a lot of them are watching music in their daily experience. They're not just listening to it. So I'm fascinated by connecting the world of music and media to the concert world, and also by finding some of these composers, younger composers like Viet Quang. Aaron Perrine is a stunning composer. Some really amazing up-and-coming people that do look like the kids that are in our ensembles.
It's so funny. Bruce Broughton, I love his tuba concerto. We played it several years ago. It was like the best song ever. I love that piece.
The piccolo concerto, I mean, no one would ever pick a piccolo concerto for 25 minutes. It's one of my favorite pieces of music. It's really
simple. That's how I feel about his tuba. It's funny. Travis, you were talking a little bit earlier about how, you're at UCLA where your students are they want to become performers. So you feel like you have to give this, this standard repertoire. So as we go forward, what are some things that you think about that you can do that is going to change that trajectory of what people are expecting? Like, how can we get to that next step of where diversity is now the standard versus the old, the dead white guys?
Well, I think, let me answer that quickly by saying that I think there are lots of different ways this is going to happen, in lots of different places and in lots of different timelines. Some people are going to throw a revolution and overthrow the system and start out with something entirely different, and other people are going to move the aircraft carrier or the Ever Given shipping cargo container in the Suez Canal. They're going to move it very, very slowly by degrees. And I'm reticent to say there's a right way and a wrong way. I think that people who have been aggrieved and people who have been marginalized and people who are victims of injustice, it is not fair to say, give us some time. It's going to take a while to fix this and allow you to be full partners and value your contributions. So I understand that that's inherently a problematic position, but we live in a society. And we live in a capitalist corporatist society that has these realities in place, and so most of us exist in institutions which are inherently risk averse and change averse. So to very kind of, well, not very, as close as I can get to very succinctly answer your question, I think we're going to see a lot of experiments. We're going to see some people do really wild and crazy things that turn everything on its ear. And then we're going to see some people who add one piece per concert by a person who isn't a white European male. And I think different people are going to have different levels of comfort. Lots of people are going to make mistakes. I hope that while acknowledging that nothing other than tomorrow or yesterday is fast enough for the people who have been most marginalized and victimized, while acknowledging that, I hope we will exercise grace for ourselves and grace for each other as we do this difficult work, because people are gonna screw up. And by people, I mean every single one of us is gonna screw up. We all have a blind spot. There might be someone who is so marginalized at every intersection that they don't have a blind spot, but most of us have a blind spot. I'm a cisgender male. I'm a person of color. I'm not white. I've got an angle and a perspective there, but there are other things where I am as institutional as it comes. So we all have blind spots. I hope that we don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. I hope that people take steps forward however they can. I hope that we encourage people who do that, even while continuing to hold them accountable and push them. And I hope people do that to me. I have friends who do, who say, well, you're not doing enough of this. You're not doing enough of this. But I hope that they do it in a gracious and empathetic way that acknowledges we are all trying to do better. We're all trying to move in the right direction. And this will be the slow work of thousands of people moving in very different ways in very different places, and may we all find as much success as we can doing that, and through our shared efforts and mistakes and failures and false starts, may we all leave a profession and an art field and a genre and institutions that are more diverse and more welcome and more open and more relevant and more vibrant than they were when we found them. And I think that's the best we can really promise to do.
That's great. I mean, speaking of being well fed and well nourished, I think this conversation has nourished us all, and hopefully set us all up here, but also those listening and watching to help nourish the next generation. I really love that analogy. We are what we eat, and we certainly are responsible for what we feed our musical children. And we might blame our musical parents, but no, they did a great job teaching us, getting us to where we were, of course. This has been fascinating. I've fully enjoyed listening to all of you and meeting all of you. Thank you all for watching and listening. This will be found on our website, everythingconducting.com, where you'll find an amazing Composer Database by Anna Edwards, really trying to highlight underrepresented composers. You'll find the Upbeat podcast hosted by Enrico and John. They do a fantastic job and have a very special guest this month in Mallory Thompson, the director of bands or wind orchestras at Northwestern. And of course, you'll find our article database, which we're slowly building bigger and bigger, trying to address more needs of our conducting friends and colleagues. So if you have a student or someone who was interested in conducting, you can always direct them there to find articles to help them maybe get to that next level of their career and education. Thank you all for listening. Thank you all for being our guests, and we'll see you on the next roundtable at everythingconducting.com.